Welcome to the Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, a program dedicated to uncovering the unified nature of reality and humanity's ever-evolving place as truly galactic beings. For more information on the Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit us online at www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on the Science of Magic, coming to you through the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. We can also be found on www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. This hour we'll be exploring Iktomayo, or spider. One day over 40 years ago, I was moving stacked wood to start a lodge fire under my teacher's watchful eye. He taught me not to carelessly throw the wood around. One must show respect to the standing people who offered up their lives for the sacred Inipi ceremony. Each stick and log has a blessed place in the fire and must be handled with reverence. It was the first time I was granted the honor of being firekeeper, so I was taking great care to do it right. Suddenly, a spider dashed out from under the log I'd picked up, ran across my wrist, webbed herself to the ground, and disappeared in the brush. To my utter humiliation, I squealed and dropped the wood. Rather than chastising me, as I fully expected, my normally silent Lakota teacher said, Iktomayo, wrote the first alphabet. She's also the weaver of all reality. No matter how I questioned him in the issue, he would say no more. I've pondered his statement ever since. Most every culture on the planet has a shamanic practice at its roots. While practices vary from culture to culture, they have an amazing amount of factors in common. One of those is the shamanic journey trance. This altered state of consciousness is an interactive dream, whereby the information found at the quantum level is translated through the imagination to the brain by the way of the shamanic metaphor. This metaphor or mystical story is also common to all shamanic practices. As a budding shamanic practitioner studying under my Lakota teacher, I experienced extreme frustration. First, when his only answers to my questions came in the form of seemingly unrelated stories from his tradition. And later, when I would go into the shamanic journey with a clear question, only to receive another seemingly unrelated story. Why can't anyone just answer my questions? I raged one day while we were harvesting sage. It was not the first or the last time I voiced that complaint. Because your mind is not ready to hear what your heart already knows, he patiently responded, before continuing to offer tobacco to a sage plant in his quiet, mindful way. Again, no matter how I nagged, he would say no more. I was angry with my old teacher when he died while I was still in training, leaving me without the answers I sought. In actuality, he left me with a treasure trove of stories that have deepened in meaning throughout my life, granting the answers I need at any given time in a form that I can receive them. Woven into his stories were ever-deepening truths that I'm still uncovering. These stories expanded with meaning as I contemplated them. With the expansion comes a broadening of what's possible in my world. Iktomayo became one of my major totems, though I'm just now coming to understand why. At the time, I didn't particularly like spiders, but at least I knew she had chosen to jump from that log onto my wrist during the ceremonial preparation of my first lodge fire for a very, very specific reason. Iktomayo not only gives us the ability to store information through language, but the capacity to create reality through story. If you can't imagine a thing, it does not exist for you. If it does not exist, you can't interact with it. We're crippled by the limits of our own imagination. Yet once imagined, it can be created. What is the science behind Iktomayo's amazing ability to weave reality and expand possibility through language? Our guest this hour is a scientist and a mystic who has deeply explored that very question. Louis Mehl-Madrona, MD, PhD, is a physician and executive director of Coyote Institute for Studies of Change and Transformation. The author of numerous books, including the Coyote Trilogy, he addresses healing practices from Lakota, Cherokee, and Cree traditions and how they intersect with conventional medicine. Lewis has been writing about the use of imaginary and imagery and narrative healing since the 1980s, and with his co-author, Barbara Mainguy, MA, has recently released his latest exciting and groundbreaking work, Remapping Your Mind, the Neuroscience of Self-Transformation Through Story. His website is www.mehl-madrona.com. I will introduce our very special and knowledgeable guest, Dr. Lewis Mehl-Madrona, and his amazing new work, Remapping Your Mind, after this short break. You are listening to The Science of Magic. This and other innovative episodes can always be found on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net. We're also found at X-Zone radio station, www.xzbn.net.
Searching through the night, one people, one nation, searching for the light. One people, one nation, coming from the stars.
The scientist and the mystic have been on an age-old, relentless search with one thing in common. They seek truth. Their paths converge in the 40,000-year-old practice of shamanism, an ancient science delving to the quantum level of life, facilitating healing, manifestation, and evolution. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, the founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Arts School, a unique Colorado State-certified occupational school training shamanic practitioners and teachers. We also provide classes for empowering personal lives through shamanism. Our certification classes are in week-long segments enabling international participation, and online classes and long-distance shamanic healing sessions are available. Come discover the science of magic in the limitless world of shamanism. www.findyourpathhome.com. Welcome back. This is The Science of Magic, dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our guest this hour is Dr. Lewis Mehl-Madrona, author of Remapping Your Mind, the Neuroscience of Self-Transformation Through Story. I have to tell you, Dr. Madrona's eloquent, grounded, and scientific approach to the magical power of story is a profound contribution to allopathic medicine. His ability to approach the subject as a medical doctor and a practitioner coming to medicine from indigenous origins is a much-needed bridge between science and magic. Lewis, thank you for your courage and commitment behind all you offer the planet at this time, and welcome to the Science of Magic.
Thank you for having me.
I've been excited about this because you've written quite a few books, the Coyote Trilogy as well as your latest one here. What are the other ones you've written, Lewis?
There's a book called Narrative Medicine, and then a book called The Healing Power of Story, The Promise of Narrative Psychiatry, and an older book called Mind and Matter, Foundations of Holistic Health.
Well, it sounds like this subject of the link between science and the narrative story is a favorite subject for you. Is that correct?
It is. I'm excited by story because it ties together the indigenous world and the world of neuroscience. Because neuroscience has stumbled on story as the essential template for memory in the brain, and the way in which really the brain functions best is through the manipulation of story. And indigenous people have known this for probably centuries.
It's amazing how story has been an integral part of all of our indigenous peoples worldwide. I know even the Grimm fairy tales were actually shamanic journeys, and that's why they're a little scary sometimes. But these stories or these journeys are recorded then for us to have a template to tune ourselves to in order to take in information beyond our experience. Is that the way you view it?
It is, and it's interesting that you say that because I met a couple of Weechel elders once upon a time, and we were chatting, and they told me that they wouldn't give peyote to gringos until they'd lived with them for a year and heard all the stories. They said you need to hear all the stories in order to know how to interpret your vision so you don't go bonkers.
That
And
is
if you go
so
bonkers,
amazing
you're too
because,
much. Yeah.
as a shamanic practitioner, I get to clean up the mess of a lot of these supposed ayahuasca tours where people spend money, go over, do a tour with dubious elders, in a weekend, and then come back and they're a mess because they didn't have any of the basics that they need to translate their experience. And so I'd never heard that. I can certainly see the wisdom of it. In your book, you
I think
speak of the master identity narrative. This is a little different than what we're talking about here. Would you mind explaining this concept?
it's the idea that we're called upon to construct a story to explain ourselves to the world and to ourselves. And so we have vignettes to pull from, and at any given moment, if someone says to you, "Who are you?" you'll pull some of those vignettes to explain yourself to that other person. And so the master narrative is the collection of all the vignettes that you routinely use in your various contexts to make sense of yourself to other people.
So, if I'm understanding this, depending on who's asking, I might pull from a different vignette. So, if I have a bunch of students, I might pull from my history as a shamanic practitioner. If I'm at a cocktail party, I might just say that I am an author, and so on. Is that the idea?
Absolutely. And you would tell a few stories to support whatever assertion you're making. I think the best example of this is a first date, because almost no one tells the truth on a first date. So the purpose of the stories you tell, the purpose of the stories are to get a second date or not to get a second date, depending on your reaction to the other person. And so it's a highly edited narrative, identity narrative that's presented, which is why one of my teachers, Carl Whitaker, said that for the first year of a relationship, he said, you don't actually encounter the other person. You spend the first year looking in a mirror.
That's a concept. Can you go a little deeper into that for me?
Sure. The idea is that we try to set our stories onto other people. So we try and cast other people into the roles that we need them to play. And we don't always take into account what roles they want to play. And so when you fall in love with someone, you imagine that they're the perfect character to play the role that you need of lover, soulmate, whatever words you've chosen. And so you set your stories about what lovers are, what soulmates are, what partners are onto this person, and they may not fit. There may be roughness around the edges. And Carl used to say that it takes about a year to actually notice the other person's stories, that they might be different from the ones you're imagining that they're telling. So he recommended 2 years courtship, because if you still like them in 2 years, then you'll probably like them forever.
I can certainly see the wisdom of that. So, what I'm hearing you say, Lewis, is that we really spend more time casting other people in the role that fits our narrative than what they might be living.
we need other people to play roles for us, and when we're seeking creatures, so we're seeking love, and we're seeking belongingness, and we're seeking maybe excitement, and we're seeking security, and so we have stories about how other people should help us to attain these goals. And so when we meet other people, sometimes we move too quickly to cast them in our play, and they may not fit the role, but typically we haven't learned to be good listeners. And so we're mostly hearing our own stories and not the stories of the people we meet. So part of building what's called narrative competence is learning how to carefully listen to the story of another person without judging it, interpreting it, or trying to make it one of your stories, but just taking in what the other person is saying and contemplating that story until understanding grows.
I remember a lot of Native elders I've worked with have that kind of approach, the ability that they have to deeply listen. I mean, I know my teacher would lean forward, close his eyes, and kind of block out the world, and you thought, is he going to sleep? But actually, he was just giving your story, if you will, I guess, absolute, full, and undivided attention. Why do you think we've lost that, and how can we regain that ability?
Well, I think it's part of modern culture that we're in a hurry. And I think, if you think about relationships, somewhere in the 30s, people started to want to fall in love instantly. And the movies of the 40s and the 50s are all about love at first sight. I think about How to Marry a Millionaire is a famous movie that fits that genre, or Three Coins in a Fountain, or the list goes on. And we want everything to be immediate. We want instant enlightenment, instant love, instant security, instant wealth. And indigenous people would tell you that these things don't come quickly, and you know probably from your own experiences that it takes a while to work at learning a tradition. It takes 20 years, even 30 years, to learn an indigenous tradition, and sometimes maybe we never feel like we've learned it, but we just discover that we're the oldest person in the room, and everybody thinks we know it, and so we just have to pretend like we're smart. But that's so different from this idea that everything should happen immediately. And I think that's when you talk about the ayahuasca weekends, that it's really that genre of the story that says that we can get it right away, right now, immediately, without having to spend a long time and work hard at it. And that may not be a good survival story.
How do you mean a survival story?
Well, it turns out that these instant gratification stories are often associated with environmental destruction. And so when we talk about instant enlightenment stories, we see, as you mentioned, sort of destruction of the integrity of the individual. But when we talk about instant wealth stories, we see destruction of the environment, so that greed destroys the earth. And so if we're willing to do things slowly, we're willing to do things more ecologically. We're willing to grow plants more slowly without chemical fertilizers. We're willing to work with the bugs without insecticides and pesticides. We're willing to work a little harder. It's harder work to grow food without insecticides, pesticides, and fertilizers.
But it's ever so much more rewarding. We're going to have to take a little break here, Louis. We'll return to our discussion after this short break. You're listening to The Science of Magic. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Do you want to hear more? Other innovative episodes can always be found on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net. We'll return to this riveting discussion with Lewis after this short break.
One people, one nation, searching through the night. One people, one nation, searching for the light. One people, one nation, coming from the stars.
The scientist and the mystic have been on an age-old, relentless search with one thing in common. They seek truth. Their paths converge in the 40,000-year-old practice of shamanism, an ancient science delving to the quantum level of life, facilitating healing, manifestation, and evolution. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, the founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Arts School, a unique Colorado State certified occupational school training shamanic practitioners and teachers. We also provide classes for empowering personal lives through shamanism. Our certification classes are in week-long segments enabling international participation, and online classes and long-distance shamanic healing sessions are available. Come discover the science of magic in the limitless world of shamanism. www.findyourpathhome.com. Welcome back. This is the Science of Magic, a place where magic and science come together to promote enlightenment. We can be found on www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our special guest this hour is physician and author Dr. Lewis Mehl-Madrona, author of Remapping Your Mind. His website is www.mehl-madrona.com. Welcome back, Lewis. I've got a quick question for you here. We were talking about master identity narrative, and that just fascinates me because it seems like it's the way we, from what you say, are defining each other and ourselves. So how does master identity narrative differ from truth?
Well, if we're working in this narrative paradigm, we don't actually define truth, and that may be surprising to some people, but we talk about how well does the story work and how beautiful is it. And so I'll give you an example. I met an Australian elder who told me that there are 550 different creation stories in Australia, and they're all true, and they're all different. And so I said, how so, Uncle? And he said, well, they're all true for the people who tell them in the place where they're told. And that's such a different concept than our logical, empiricistic Western concept of truth, which philosophers obsess about. You know, in the Western philosophical tradition, we want to know, well, which story is true? Only one of them can be true because they're contradictory. But in the aboriginal concept, no, they're all true. And so we talk about explanatory pluralism, that there's many ways to explain the same phenomena, and they don't have to reduce into each other, that they can seem contradictory, and that's okay. They can all be useful. And so we don't talk about what's true, we talk about what works. And if you tell me a story, then I'm going to be curious how well it works for you. So if your story is that, let me think of an example from a recent client. Okay, so if your story is that you fall in love right away with exciting male characters, and they're a little bit edgy, and they're a little dangerous, and just like in Pride and Prejudice, you work the edginess and the dangerousness out of them, leaving the perfect partner. I met someone recently with that story. It's an interesting story. It worked well in Pride and Prejudice, and it worked well in Wuthering Heights. But I asked her, how well has it worked for you? And she had to think about it, and she said, well, I haven't found anyone that I want to stay with long term yet. And I said, do you know anyone, with this idea about love? Do you know anyone that this has worked for? And she said, well, no, but it has to have worked for someone. So I said, well, go find someone. Go look for someone for whom that story worked. And she came back in a couple of weeks and she said, I can't find anyone. So I said, it's a great story, but maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it only works in literature. Maybe it only works for Jane Austen. Maybe it doesn't actually work in 2015 for ordinary people living in Maine. And so I proposed an experiment to her in which she only dated people that she wasn't attracted to initially for a period of time. That she not go out with anyone she found exciting. And she said, well, it sounds crazy, but nothing has worked so far, so why not? So it turned out that the experiment was wildly successful. She ended up meeting the right guy, started dating him eventually. They got married, things are going well. And it was just that she had a story about how to identify the right guy and then change him that didn't work. And because the kind of guy that she wanted was not edgy or dangerous, but at first those kind of guys didn't seem very interesting. So we wouldn't say, well, what's the true story? We would say, so how's that working for you? And actually it's quite aesthetic. I mean, it's a beautiful story. It just wasn't working very well. So it's a different way of thinking in which we really recognize that it's probably impossible to say what's true.
So how about the reverse of this? Do we restrict ourselves to our stories and recreate the same undesirable outcome?
We do, because as you've probably heard, the evil that we know is better than the evil that we don't know. And how many times have we heard people say that? So people, it's a great luxury to be able to reflect on one's life and one's stories. And people who don't have enough food, shelter, etc., don't have the luxury to do that. And I think one of the things that happens when one is on a spiritual path or when one is working psychologically is that we begin to appreciate the importance of reflecting upon our own stories and the stories of the culture that we live in. And that's a great luxury. And when we do that, we sometimes notice that we've been doing the same thing over and over and over, expecting it to work the next time. And someone said that's the definition of crazy, is to keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting that it'll work the next time. So, but we get stuck. It's like if some people, when they get stuck in the mud or the snow, they just rev the engine and make the wheel spin faster and faster and faster and dig themselves into the rut deeper and deeper and deeper. They don't realize that you got to get out of your car and find some wood to put down so that your tire has some traction so you can get out of that hole. And so many of us spend our lives just gunning the engine, spinning the wheel, trying to get out of the hole we're digging ourselves in the same way every time, and it doesn't work. And
Is there a way to dismantle these stories that aren't working so they aren't still in our field, if you will?
Well, I think that's what we do when we talk story with each other. When we hear other people's stories, we reflect on our own stories, and sometimes we think to ourselves, that's a better way to do it. Maybe I'll try it that way next time. And, that's why we have medical conferences. We go hear other people's stories about how they treat particular problems. And sometimes we come away saying, hey, that's a better story. I think I'll try that story. And so I think it's part of human life, to share stories with each other and to reflect upon other people's stories and how different they are from our own, and to wonder if their stories might work better. Or if at least it's worth a try, to do something differently. And the problem comes when we isolate ourselves and we don't listen to anyone who's different from us. When we surround ourselves with people who are exactly like us. And I think that's what happens in closed communities, that people go deeper and deeper into a rut because they don't have that opportunity to hear other perspectives. That's the beauty of a multicultural,
And thus the creation of a cult. We're going to have to take another short break here. You've been listening to The Science of Magic. We'll be back on the flip side of this short break. You're listening to our theme song, One People, One Nation. It's from the Winds of Time album by my musical group Starfire and can be found on iTunes.com, cdbaby.com, Amazon.com, and my website, gwildawiyaka.com. See you on the flip side. The scientist and the mystic have been on an age-old, relentless search with one thing in common. They seek truth. Their paths converge in the 40,000-year-old practice of shamanism, an ancient science delving to the quantum level of life, facilitating healing, manifestation, and evolution. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, the founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Arts School, a unique Colorado State certified occupational school training shamanic practitioners and teachers. We also provide classes for empowering personal lives through shamanism. Our certification classes are in week-long segments enabling international participation, and online classes and long-distance shamanic healing sessions are available. Come discover the science of magic in the limitless world of shamanism. www.findyourpathhome.com. Welcome back. This is The Science of Magic, a place where magic and science come together to promote enlightenment. We can be found on www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our very special guest this hour is physician and author Dr. Mehl-Madrona, author of Remapping Your Mind. Louis, there's some interesting things that we've been discussing about stories and storytelling. How do you suggest that we become more conscious of our stories so we control them rather than them controlling us?
I think one of the ways to begin is to ask oneself the question, so what am I seeking? What am I looking for? And then to ask the question, how is it that I'm trying to gain these things? So if you're looking for love, how are you doing that? If you're looking for security, how are you doing that? So each of the answers to those how questions is a story. And what works really well for self-reflection is to write that story down in the third person as if it's someone else. And what makes it even more powerful, maybe because it gives a little bit more distance from it, is to turn all the characters into animals. And just like in childhood, when all of our stories were about animals who were pretending to be people. And because, as the elders tell us that once upon a time before there were people, all the animals had to act like people. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to write a story about a high point of your life. Write a story about a low point of your life. Write a story about a time when things changed. There's a website, the Northwestern University Life Story Inventory, that helps people to do that. There's also another website that Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto has, which helps people to write their story, to write their life story. So it's really a matter of sitting down and beginning the process of reflection. And 4 questions that I wrote about in Coyote Medicine that an elder gave me that proved to be really valuable were, who are you? Where did you come from? Where are you going? And why are you here? And imagine all the different answers you can make to that question. There's so many different levels you can address that question from, and they're all good. They're all important. And so I think the first step is to take the time to play with story.
I like that. You mentioned that people can change each other's brains by telling each other stories. How does that happen?
When you tell a story, you activate the same parts of the brain in the other person that are activated in you with about a 6-second delay. It's called speaker-listener neurocoupling. And so there's story mirror neurons. And so when we activate someone else's brain, we perhaps slightly, but nevertheless significantly, make it more likely that those areas will activate again. And the more those areas activate, the more likely they are to activate, which is called Hebsian learning, which is a part of neurophysiology. And so the more you tell someone the same story, the more they incorporate it, the more it becomes their story. Unfortunately, this is what they do in brainwashing. But, the neurophysiology can be used for good or evil. And if we want to use it for good, then we should focus on telling good stories to other people, telling good stories to the people we meet. I supervise doctors in training, and I try to make a point to praise them every day. I try to make a point to say something that they did really well every day, because I want them to incorporate that sense of their competence, that they're a good doctor, that they're doing things well. And in that way, we change the other person's brain.
So
we build different synaptic connections.
What implications does this have regarding the violent and sensational stories we often expose ourselves through movies or TV, games, or even the news?
Well, I think that you go in the direction where you put your attention. And so if you put your attention in fearful places, you become more fearful. If you put your attention toward healing places, you become more healing. And negative stories sell better than positive stories. There's probably a neurophysiological basis for that, because we learn better from negative events than positive, probably because negative things can kill us, perhaps, but positive things probably won't kill us. And so we're hardwired in our brains to pay more attention to the negative than the positive. So in a context in which there's no physical danger, then we have to discipline ourselves to pay more attention to the positive than the negative. Because if we want things to get better, if we want to suffer less, then we have to focus on the positive. And of course, there's the whole field of positive psychology, which is based on that principle. And Mark Twain recognized the same phenomena. He said, if you want to be happy, be content with what you have. Tell good stories. So, I think we live in a world where negative sells, and we have to work to bring the positive into prominence.
So what do you see stories as having to do with manifestation?
With manifestation?
Mm-hmm.
So,
like, what do we create as a result of our stories?
Well, stories tell us how to create. So stories tell us what is the strategy I should use to create what I want, or to get what I want, or to find what I want. So, and stories even tell us what we should want. So, we all have a story about the good life. And we all have a story about what is the meaning of life, what is the purpose of life. And they can be radically different stories. And so we begin with if we didn't have story, we wouldn't know what to do with ourselves. We would just sort of sit there puzzled, befuddled, not knowing how to even perceive the world, because stories tell us what to put in the foreground and what to put in the background, and how to recognize which of the pixels that we see, are relevant to us and which are not. What can we ignore and what do we have to pay attention to? So stories are really fundamental to the way that we conduct our lives and what we go after. So if your story is, well, it's all about me and I should do whatever it takes to get what I want, well, that might not be so kind to other people.
Might not work for others. This time has just flown, Louis, and I can't thank you enough for being on our show, but unfortunately, it's time to close. This has been The Science of Magic. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Remember, you can always listen to this and other provoking episodes on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net. Until next time, dear ones, may you be blessed with knowledge, comforted with love, and tell beautiful stories.
One people, one nation.